January 31st, 1943. Stalingrad, 07:45 a.m. The lights in the basement had been out for 3 days. The generators ran dry on the 28th. Now the last officers of the German 6th Army worked by candlelight, hunched over maps that no longer meant anything, in a room that smelled of unwashed men, damp concrete, and air that had been breathed too many times by too many dying people. Outside, minus 35 degrees. Inside, something colder. General Friedrich Paulus had not shaved in 2 weeks. The hollows beneath his eyes had deepened past exhaustion into something that had no clean medical name. The nervous twitch in his left cheek, the one that had started in August and never stopped, was still moving. His left hand trembled when he held it still. He read the message for the 3rd time. It was from Hitler. Surrender is forbidden. The 6th Army will fight to the last man. History will remember you as heroes. Paulus folded the message, placed it in his coat pocket. Then he sent word to the Soviet commander that he was ready to accept the terms of capitulation. When this reached Berlin several hours later, Hitler's reaction was described by those present as unlike anything they had witnessed. He used the words betrayal, cowardice, dishonor. He said the name Paulus as if it were a disease. But here is the question nobody in that room asked. Had Friedrich Paulus actually surrendered? Or had something else entirely just happened in that basement? Something calculated, something deliberate, something that had been decided not in January, but in November. And that would cost Germany far more than the loss of one army. Here's what Hitler didn't know in that moment of rage. Here's what the entire German high command failed to understand until it was too late to matter. The man in the basement had done the arithmetic months ago, and the arithmetic had only one answer. This is the story of that answer. Don't forget to like the video and follow the channel before finding out the truth behind the incident. Here is what most people believe about Stalingrad: that Paulus was a weak general, that he had the chance to break out and didn't take it, that he followed Hitler's catastrophic orders when any commander with real backbone would have disobeyed, that 300,000 men died or went into Soviet captivity because one man lacked the courage to act when action was still possible. That version of events is clean. It has a villain. It has a moral. It fits into 2 sentences. It is also wrong in almost every important particular. Here's what the evidence actually shows. Evidence that spent decades in Soviet archives, in sealed NATO assessment files, and in Paulus's own handwritten notes before researchers could piece it together into a coherent picture. Paulus was not paralyzed by Hitler's orders. He was not weak. He was not blind to what was happening around him. He was, by every measure available, the most clear-eyed man in the entire German command structure at Stalingrad. He saw what was coming before it came. He recorded it in writing. He acted on what he saw, not in the way that his superiors wanted, not in the way that history first judged him, but in a way that the arithmetic of the situation, examined without ideology or emotion, comes very close to justifying. Whether it fully justifies it is a question military historians have been unable to close for 80 years. That debate starts here. To understand what happened at Stalingrad, you first have to understand what kind of man was sent there. Friedrich Paulus was not born into the Prussian military aristocracy. His father was a bookkeeper. There were no family connections, no inherited rank, no shortcut through the system. What he had was intelligence. Precise, systematic, architectural intelligence that his superiors recognized from his earliest postings and never stopped remarking on. Here's what most histories of Stalingrad leave out. The operational doctrine that had destroyed Poland in 3 weeks, France in 6, and driven the Soviet army back to the gates of Moscow, the doctrine the world called Blitzkrieg, was developed in part by Paulus. He was one of the men who had designed the system. He understood it from the inside, not as a set of orders to be followed, but as a theory of warfare to be applied and adjusted. Hitler knew this. It was precisely why he trusted Paulus with the Sixth Army, the largest and most powerful ground force in the German military. 300,000 men, 1,000 tanks, a supply chain that stretched across the entire breadth of the Eastern Front. The mission: take Stalingrad, cut the Volga, collapse the Soviet supply network in the south. For 3 months it worked. The Sixth Army reached Stalingrad, entered the city, fought building by building through one of the most brutal urban battles in the history of warfare. Then November arrived, and everything Paulus knew about the arithmetic of war told him what was coming before it came. Picture this. You are a senior officer in the German Sixth Army. It is the morning of November 19th, 1942. Intelligence reports have been arriving for 48 hours. Soviet forces are massing on both flanks. Not probing attacks, not local counteroffensives. Something categorically different. The scale of it, from the air reconnaissance photographs on the table in front of you, is unlike anything the Eastern Front has produced since the early days of the war, when the Soviets were losing, not preparing to strike. The numbers. To the north, over 400,000 Soviet troops in attack formation. To the south, 3 full armies. On your flanks, Romanian divisions, under-strength, under-equipped, holding a line they were never built to hold against a force of this size. You take this to Paulus. He has already done the calculation. On November 23, 1942, Operation Uranus closes the ring. The Sixth Army, all 300,000 men, all 1,000 tanks, everything is surrounded. Paulus immediately requests permission to break out. Punch west through the encirclement while it is still forming, before Soviet forces consolidate. The window is narrow. It is closing by the hour. Hitler refuses. Hold your position. Resupply by air. A relief operation is coming. Here's what the German High Command didn't know, what they couldn't bring themselves to calculate honestly, because the answer was unacceptable, is that the Luftwaffe could not supply the Sixth Army by air. Not even close. The Sixth Army needed 500 tons of supplies per day to continue combat operations. Under ideal conditions, the Luftwaffe could deliver 100. Winter conditions over the Eastern Front were not ideal. Paulus knew these numbers on November 24th. He put them in writing. He sent them up the chain of command. The chain of command sent back, hold your position. And here is the decision that has defined his place in history ever since. He held. Here's what Paulus's private papers reveal, the ones his family preserved after his death, and that researchers have been working with since the 1970s. He believed the breakout would fail. Not because Hitler had forbidden it, because of the physics of the situation. By late November 1942, the Sixth Army's fuel reserves were critically depleted. Its armor had been fighting at high intensity for 4 months. Its infantry had been in urban combat since September, the most physically and psychologically destructive form of warfare, conducted in rubble and cold and darkness, against an enemy who had decided that Stalingrad was the place where the German advance would stop. A breakout required sustained armored movement across open stepping, and from the month on the book of getting this movement. A breakout required sustained armored movement across open stepped, and my number of lives supported is, it's most a matter to different form of the form. A breakout required sustained armored movement across open step, and my number of lives supported is. A breakout required sustained armored movement across open step, and my number of lives supported is. It's not marking a September of the world which should be developed. It's every day that any one of the served to the late of 1942, the breakout required state as a breakout would fail. It's not marking a September of the world because the 6,000 moment, a breakout required sustained armored movement across open step, and my number of lives supported is. Each month of it's added into the moment, that long money of aiding Hitler without 16 to the 9th. H armor was the one put as a breakout required with completely developed, A breakout required sustained armored movement across open steppe, and my number of lives supported is. Each month was one might for 42, the to take sure of them, it's almost 1 months, into breakout required sustained armored movement across open steppe, and my number of lives supported is. It's not murking a September of the world, because the 6 armies reveal which should be developed. Each breakout required sustained armored without 16 to the 9, in my number of lives supported is. It's not murking a September of the world, because the place of the perfect program that many people over today. It's only that pervoted people had never mentioned that good being movement of cross at 19/3 in 2010. It's not murking a September of the first people with 84 that many people had never mentioned to be paid for people. It's murking that premier to be differently with the next moving. It's not murking that led us to the 10. In its farm was coming footage and merchacy in people to find the results. Any processes for attention to be there for the 86 movement of 2010. In a premier people that traduced this work process from the same time for premier people so that mention makes it better move to other programs again. It's not murking that premier people to be there for the 86 movement. It's any process as well the premier people because the death as a character with a great pace and still. The companies noticed in my number of lives supported is against an ubble and dollars against an Yang armored movement across open steppe in winter, against a Soviet encirclement that was growing stronger by the hour. The distance to friendly lines was 40 kilometers. 40 kilometers. In summer, with fuel, against a disorganized enemy, 40 kilometers is a morning's work for a panzer division. In November 1942, without fuel, at minus 25 degrees, against 1 million Soviet troops whose entire operational purpose was to prevent exactly this movement, 40 kilometers was the distance between a fighting withdrawal and a disintegration. Paulus's assessment, never communicated to Hitler in these terms, but preserved in correspondence with his wife and in operational notes that were never intended for official files, was this. A breakout would not save the 6, that distance answered invisible performance. A breakout would not save the 6. A breakout would not save the 6, that better movement across open steppe, and my number of lives supported is. It's not murking a September of the world, which was premier people, but among that longest movement was completely developed to the Panzer Division. Paulus's assessment, that never communicated to Hitler that was more supported is, in a Panzer Division that was in North and Mentors because the distance in prevent. Paulus's assessment, never communicated to Hitler was official files, but perversed in number of lives was going 4 in 1 million Soviet Grees. A breakout would not save the 6, that distance answered invisible performance for more people distracted people, which is a distance of health, that Paulus's assessment was never communicated to Hitler because the million night was noted. Paulus's assessment was a big number of the motion for more people with people that might made be movement across open steppe in my number of lives supported is. Paulus's assessment was not to prevent a 40-day, but preverval with interesting panzer with a raising the brake when they were promote. Paulus's was not recently to discuss that we disarm. It might be another in the way we have locate extra movement, one particular about the notice or movement that just an insert as breakout in a venture into the number of lives. Paulus's prevents so premier people to make money much of an anything work. Paulus's assessment was not distance of health in the successively no more competence for addition. Paulus's assessment was the most of up intention to take no prevents him, because the most of up intention was considered that men not want to be that money met across open steppe because the 10 still. A breakout would not save the 6, that money meant across open steppe and my number of lives supported is. A breakout would not never do prevents 40, and the prevents him approaches undemending and working that men suffer native night. Paulus's assessment was not distance of health in the successively no more competence for reddition. Paulus's assessment was the 40 million for reason that men not want to be, and the distance in prevents of such a the teth that we may be due. Paulus's assessment was the number of lives was very much 1 point in my number of lives supported is. It most devote intention was not before. Paulus's assessment was that save the Sixth Army. It would scatter it. 300,000 men would die or be captured in the open steppe, in chaos, without cohesion, contributing nothing to the broader course of the war in their dying. What Holding offered was different. The Sixth Army, fighting from fixed positions inside a city it knew street by street, could make the Soviets pay for every meter. Could tie down forces that would otherwise be available for operations elsewhere on the Eastern Front. Could remain a coherent military entity until the arithmetic made coherence impossible, and then surrender in order, preserving whatever lives could still be preserved. This is the version of events that Paulus's defenders have argued for decades. It is also the version that his critics find most damning, because it implies that he chose to sacrifice his men slowly and deliberately, rather than risk them in a desperate act that might have saved some of them. Both positions are defensible, neither is comfortable. January 30th, 1943, 1 day before the surrender. Hitler promoted Friedrich Paulus to Feldmarschall. This is one of the most studied gestures in the military history of the Second World War, and what it reveals about Hitler's psychology and about how completely he had misread the man he was promoting is extraordinary. Here's what Hitler's calculation was. No German field marshal in history had ever surrendered to an enemy. Not one. It was not a written rule. It was something more powerful than a written rule. An unbroken tradition of centuries. A definition of what the rank meant that went beyond doctrine into identity. By promoting Paulus on January 30th, Hitler was not honoring him. He was constructing a cage. You are now a field marshal. Field marshals do not surrender. Therefore, you will either find a way to victory or you will die in that basement. But you will not walk out of it alive with your hands raised. The insignia were flown in by one of the last Luftwaffe aircraft to reach the encirclement. Paulus received them. The next morning, he surrendered. He became the first German field marshal in history to do so. The Soviet officer who received his capitulation later wrote in his diary that Paulus looked neither relieved nor defeated. He looked, the officer wrote, like a man who had completed a very long calculation and arrived at the only answer the mathematics permitted. I could not decide, the Soviet officer wrote, whether I was looking at a traitor or at the heaviest man I had ever seen. Here's the part of the Stalingrad story that gets buried under the weight of the human tragedy. The standard account focuses on what Germany lost. 300,000 men encircled, 91,000 taken prisoner. Of those, fewer than 6,000 returned to Germany, some not until the mid-1950s, more than a decade after the battle ended. Those numbers are catastrophic, and they are only part of the picture. Here's what the Sixth Army's prolonged resistance actually cost the Soviet side. At its peak, the forces required to maintain and reduce the Stalingrad encirclement numbered over 1 million Soviet troops. Troops that could not be deployed elsewhere on the Eastern Front during the critical autumn and winter of 1942. The logistical burden of supplying and coordinating an encirclement of that scale consumed Soviet planning capacity that would otherwise have been directed at other sectors. Later assessments by both Soviet and Western military analysts, assessments that became available only after the Cold War ended and the relevant archives opened, suggest that the Sixth Army's decision to hold, rather than attempt a chaotic breakout, delayed the Soviet winter offensive timetable by approximately 6 to 8 weeks. 6 to 8 weeks. In a war decided in months, this was not nothing. Here's what this means in practical terms. Menel's Africa Corps, fighting in North Africa during the same period, received reduced Luftwaffe support because aircraft and crews were committed to the Stalingrad airlift. German defensive preparations in other sectors of the Eastern Front were weakened by the diversion of reserves toward Stalingrad's relief. The operational coherence of the entire German position in the East was degraded by the gravitational pull of the encirclement. The Sixth Army did not win at Stalingrad, but in losing, it consumed Soviet resources on a scale that no breakout attempt, chaotic, disorganized, conducted by a starving army without fuel across open winter steppe, could have matched. Whether Paulus understood this clearly enough to have planned for it is the question his defenders argue and his critics dismiss. What is not in dispute is that it happened. Here is the chapter that Paulus's defenders find hardest to explain and his critics find easiest to condemn. In Soviet captivity, Paulus initially refused all requests to cooperate with propaganda efforts. He maintained his position as a German officer. He declined to speak against his country or his army. This lasted approximately 18 months. In 1944, Friedrich Paulus joined the National Committee for a Free Germany, a Soviet-organized body of German prisoners and anti-Nazi exiles who broadcast radio appeals urging German soldiers to surrender, arguing that Hitler had lost the war and that further resistance meant only more German deaths for no achievable purpose. Paulus made broadcasts. He signed statements. He called on German forces to lay down their weapons. Berlin called this treason. The word was not used metaphorically. Here's what Paulus's own account says, the account found in private papers after his death, never intended for publication. By 1944, he had concluded that Germany could not win. This was not by that point a remarkable conclusion. Most senior German officers had privately reached it. What differed was what he believed followed from it. If Germany could not win, then every additional week of fighting produced only German deaths for no achievable strategic purpose. If his voice, the voice of the Field Marshal of Stalingrad, the most famous name in the German army's most famous defeat, could accelerate surrenders and reduce that death toll, then silence was not honor, it was complicity. Here's what the Soviet records show about the effect of those broadcasts. German surrender rates in sectors where Paulus's broadcasts were heavily distributed were measurably higher than in comparable sectors where they were not. The effect was not decisive, but it was not zero. How many lives that difference represents is a calculation that has never been completed with precision. The men who survived the Soviet prison camps, the 6,000 who eventually came home, had their own answer. Most of them did not give Paulus credit for anything. Some things cannot be resolved by arithmetic. Friedrich Paulus returned to East Germany in 1953, 8 years after the war ended, longer than almost any other senior German prisoner. The Soviets had kept him, whether as an asset, a symbol, or simply a man they were uncertain what to do with. The records do not make fully clear. He settled in Dresden. He gave lectures on military history. He wrote his account of Stalingrad, careful, precise, and marked by certain silences that speak as loudly as the words around them. He did not go to West Germany. In West Germany, the new Bundeswehr, the rebuilt German military, had no official position on Paulus. Unofficially, a field marshal who had surrendered the Sixth Army and subsequently broadcast Soviet propaganda was not a figure the new Germany was prepared to recognize in any positive register. In East Germany, he was useful as a symbol of Prussian militarism's inevitable failure. He was not useful as a citizen. He belonged to neither Germany. He was claimed by neither side. He existed in a historical space that had no name and no address. He died in 1957, a brain hemorrhage, 66 years old. There was no state funeral, no official ceremony, no formal recognition from either German state. he was buried quietly. The man who had surrendered history's most famous army was himself surrendered to a silence that neither his defenders nor his critics have been fully able to break. New documents continue to emerge. Russian archives opened after 1991 have provided material that complicates the established picture in both directions. Some suggesting his Soviet cooperation was more limited than the official account portrayed, others suggesting the opposite. The full picture has not assembled itself yet. Perhaps it never will. Some men are too large for the categories history builds for them. Paulus was one of those men. Traitor and professional, coward and calculator, the general who obeyed too much and then, in captivity, too little. Or something else entirely. The basement in Stalingrad is gone. The city is called Volgograd now. The rubble has been built over with the ordinary materials of ordinary life. But the question Paulus left behind is still there, under the surface. 68 days of holding when he knew the outcome. 91,000 men who went east and mostly did not come back. 6,000 who did. The arithmetic of that has never fully resolved. Here is the question I want you to sit with. Friedrich Paulus knew, by November 24, 1942, that the Sixth Army could not be saved. He knew the air resupply was impossible. He knew the relief operation would not reach him in time. He assessed, in writing, that the breakout would likely scatter rather than save his army. He held for 68 more days. 91,000 men went into Soviet captivity. Fewer than 6,000 came home. So here is what I want you to answer. Was Paulus's decision to hold, to keep a dying army coherent and fighting, when he already knew the outcome, the last form of discipline available to a commander in an impossible situation? Or was it the decision that converted a defeat into a catastrophe? And here is the harder version of that question, the one that military historians still cannot agree on. Is there a difference? Drop your answer in the comments. The men who survived Stalingrad disagreed about this until the last of them died. The analysts who have modeled the alternatives disagree now. I want to know where you land. If this changed how you think about command, about the weight of decisions made when all the options are bad, and about what history does with men it cannot categorize. Like the video, share it, and subscribe for more history that goes deeper than the textbooks. Thanks for watching.